Pastor Brian, how do I create healthy boundaries? How do I create healthy boundaries? So I just think this is such a great question. In fact, this is a question that honestly we kind of tackle indirectly throughout the year pretty regularly because I'm a boundaries guy. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today because I just believe that the healthier you are, the more that's an indication that the more firm your boundaries are in life. And so the more firm that your boundaries are, I just believe you're just going to experience greater life, okay? So as we're just going to talk about that for the next 5 weeks, and we're going to talk about it in all kinds of different areas of our life, and hopefully you'll get something out of that. Now, as we get started today, I kind of thought this was just a great illustration because what you may not know is that there are thousands and thousands of athletes right now that are actually preparing for the 2024 Summer Olympics, okay? Do we have anybody here who fits that category? Okay, maybe somebody online is preparing for the Olympics, okay? I honestly thought when I was younger that I could have been an Olympian in downhill skiing. I was pretty good. And when you ski 100 days a year, that qualifies you for something, right? And so I used to be pretty good at that. But what's interesting about all of the Olympics and all the athletes that are preparing right now is that there are people that have literally spent years and years and years of their life for a competition that will literally only take 1 to 2 minutes long on a world stage. And what's interesting is that most of the time, these athletes, they come from all over the world, and most of the time, what separates the winner from a loser is literally a 1/10 or even a 100th of a second. Isn't that amazing? And so really what we've learned through the Olympic Games is that there is literally no room for error when you operate at that high of a level. There's no room for a mistake. I mean, you got your shoelace just a little bit too loose or a little too, that could be catastrophic. I mean, you think about tenths or hundredths of a second, and this is something that you've trained for years and years and years upon your life, that there's just no room for error. Now, maybe Olympics aren't your jam. Maybe you like watching the X Games, which are, honestly, a lot of the X Games are kind of moving into the Olympics now. I was surprised to see that skateboarding is now an Olympic sport. I didn't know that when we started that back in the early 80s that would become that way, but it is. But maybe you're a little more on the edge kind of person. Maybe you like the drag races or NASCAR or motocross, where maybe the thrill is just a little bit more dangerous, and that's kind of your thing. Either way, the thing that we have all in common is that we love cheering on a close competition, and we're hoping that the Super Bowl is going to be that way here in a couple weeks, right? Okay, but here's the thing. In the real world where you and I live, in the place of our everyday lives, there is absolutely nothing fun, there's nothing entertaining about watching people live their life where there is no room for error. Where they're stretched so specifically thin in areas of their life that it just takes one little mistake, one little error, and that error turns into devastation and can eventually take them out. And yet, what's so sad is that all of us have seen this happen at one level or another in our lives, haven't we? I mean, we've watched people, how they manage their money. We've seen people, how they manage their time. We've seen people, how they manage their priorities, how people, they might party a little too hard and that catches up to them, or they might risk a little too much. They might get angry one too many times and pop their cork one too many times and behave in a way that the people close to them just say, you know what, that's it. I'm done. You're out. I'm gone. We're over. And we've seen people in their lives who live that way. And it's just not fun watching our friends who just live their life at such a risky state in their finances that one little emergency comes along and they're just wiped out. And they're taken out of the game. And it's not fun when we see all of us, to some extent, where we cram-pack our schedules so full of stuff that honestly, you just kind of don't even enjoy doing any of it. Because all you do is you worry about getting to the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, and you just stress and you worry, and we just literally just kind of wear ourselves out running from this thing to that thing. So what's interesting about all of that is that instinctively we all know that we all need healthy boundaries in our life. Isn't that true? I mean, how many of you would agree with that? Let me just see your hands, okay? So what's so interesting about that is that it's one thing to watch a trained athlete put themselves and push themselves to the max in a competition or a game. And we appreciate that, but it's not fun watching people that we love, that we adore, that we care deeply about. It's not fun watching them push their life to the proverbial fence line into the death zone, so to speak, of whatever area of life it is that we watch them suffer in. And so the challenge with all of this is that our culture pushes us to the max in everything. And when I say everything, I mean everything. It's just like one extreme to the next. And yet what we're going to learn throughout this series for the next couple of weeks, and we're going to start talking about this today, is that God actually invites us to step back from the danger zone a little bit and invites us to live within a safe boundary. So for the next few weeks, for the sake of this series, I want to talk about boundaries, okay? And I want to identify for you what I think a healthy boundary is, okay? So here's how we're going to identify or define the word boundary in our life, okay? Is it basically it's the space between our current reality and our maximum limit. It's the space between our current reality and our maximum limit. It's the space where you're living right now. It's everything that you've got going on right now, and that space between where that ends and where your maximum limit is. Okay? So for example, and what we're going to talk about really is the idea that we need to have some extras. We need to have some reserves. Okay, what we're talking about is it's the difference between jogging and sprinting. Okay, nobody can sprint all out, full time, all the time. Hello? I mean, even the professional athletes know this, right? That's why the 400 meter is such a difficult race, because to get to the end, you really need to sprint that, but nobody can sprint for 400 meters. Nobody can, at least yet. We haven't figured it out yet, okay? So what we're talking about here is the area between how you live your life now and your crashing point. It's the idea of showing up a few minutes early instead of right on time or even a couple minutes late. It's having enough money left over at the end of the month instead of waiting for the next paycheck and you're borrowing against the next paycheck constantly, okay? It's having a little money in reserve, because you could have spent it all, but you chose to hold a little bit back. You chose to set a little aside, okay? It's the idea of when you face a crisis or a stressful situation that you don't lose your mind and become so angry that you just pop your cork and just repulse everybody around you. Okay, so when we talk about healthy boundaries over the next few weeks, what we're really explaining is that there should be enough room between the reality of our current situation and our maximum limit so that we can avoid catastrophe. Now, again, we've talked about this in many different aspects throughout the years. And what's interesting is that we actually value boundaries in our life in healthy areas, in most areas of our life. For example, when you drive, okay, most of you don't drive your vehicle to the max speed all the time. I say most because I've tried to keep up with a couple of you. Okay, most of us don't do that, right? Most of us create some boundaries when we're walking a trail and we're on a steep edge and we want to stay away from the steepness, that edge a little bit, because we know that there's dangers there, okay? Most of us create some boundaries when we're climbing ladders. Now, I say most because I've seen some of you try to climb some ladders and you're standing on the top rung, doing one of these, okay, that's dangerous, okay? But most people are smarter than that, and we're careful. Most of us create some boundaries, and we know carefully where the boundary is when it comes to handling sharp knives. Right? Okay? Yet this is so interesting to me, yet when it comes to things like our financials and our schedule and our morals and our relationships and our emotional health, oftentimes what happens is that we tend to push those things right to the max, to the limit of our capacity on any given day. And then we wonder why we have so many problems. Now, before we read a scripture today that's going to kind of launch this series off, I think it's going to be such a fun scripture to talk about, okay? I want to explain to you 3 obvious things that happen. And these are so obvious that a caveman could have figured this out. By the way, did you notice that Geico is bringing back the caveman? Okay, my favorite, okay? This is so practical. You already know the dangers of what happened when we don't have healthy boundaries, okay? So I'm just going to give you 3 of them. There's like a bunch of them, but I'm just going to give you 3, okay? The first thing that we notice when we don't have healthy boundaries is that our stress level increases, right? Okay, so here's the thing that you need to understand. The less space that you have between your current reality and your maximum limit, the less space that you have. So in other words, if you're running at your max sprinting power speed right now in any given area of your life, okay, here's what happens. The less space there is, the more your stress level goes up. Okay? Now I'm just telling you. Now you already knew that, okay? For some of you, you are on your way to church today and you experienced this very thing. Because it was 5 minutes to 10, you know that service starts at 10, and you got 15 minutes worth of driving to get there. And you're just stressed. And how many of you discovered that the traffic was the worst? And all of a sudden, you got the road rage going on, and you're screaming at every other little grandma that's trying to get to church because you had no space. You had no space between your reality and your maximum limit. You were stretched so thin that what happened is that you just begin to get stressed out. So here's the thing, is that if you're here today or if you're listening online and you just feel like your life just has tons of stress in it and you might even feel completely stressed out in all kinds of areas, I want to challenge you to think about this, that you probably have a boundary that needs to be pulled back from your maximum limit because you're operating on the edge. And I want to encourage you to just consider pulling that boundary back a little bit, okay? So here's the second thing that happens without boundaries, all right? And this might not be quite as obvious, but what actually happens is that our attention becomes self-centered. Now, this is an interesting thing because, again, when you find yourself to the max, operating on the edge of disaster all the time, when you don't have any space between your current reality and your maximum limits, instinctively what happens is that you begin to look for ways to self-preserve. Okay, did you hear me? So when we talk about self-centeredness, we're not talking about an egotistical thing. We're just talking about a self-preservation thing. And so what happens is that any kind of an emotional energy that you have, basically you're going to spend that on you, because you don't have any reserves to give to anybody else. And that really turns into self-centeredness. Looking out for me. What's going to happen to me? What about me? I don't care about you. I just care about me. And you never. And I always. And you always. And I can never. Me. And this is true in every area of our life. That when we don't allow this healthy space between our current reality and our maximum limit, we force ourselves into a danger zone that becomes very self-centered. All right, so here's the third thing, and this one here is another super obvious one, okay, is this right here. Is our relationships suffer? Now, how many of you found that to be true? Okay, when you push your boundaries to the absolute limit, your relationship suffers. Now, here's the reason why, is because relationships, they happen within healthy space. Relationships are grown, they're developed, they become healthy when you have room, when you have more time, when you have a little more money, when you have a little more headroom so that nobody's going to explode on one another. Relationships always happen within the healthy areas of our life, okay? When there's no financial pressure, when our boundary limits begin to decrease, so do the relationships in our lives. Now, yeah. Oh, there it is again. For those of you who couldn't hear online, we had a phone going off. It was a pretty cool little jam. So let me talk to you about this for just a minute, okay? One of the reasons why couples begin to struggle in their relationship over a period of time is because they used to have a vibrant relationship, but now they're struggling a little bit. The reason is because as time began to carry on, as their relationships begin to grow and foster, and they became a little more comfortable, they begin to make some choices. They begin to make some decisions that they were going to run life to the max. So they decided together as a couple that they needed a few more cars, or a nicer car, or a newer car, or a more expensive car, or a bigger house, and then a bigger house. And, they wanted to take a really nice vacation, and all those things are great. And then they start looking, and their kids come along. And, of course, we want our kids to be involved in this, and we want our kids to go to that, and we want our kids to never feel like they're being left out of anything. And so we just put our kids in everything, okay? And so here's the deal. The problem with all of that stuff is that it takes a huge amount of money and a huge amount of time to accommodate all that stuff. You hearing me? Okay. So in order to afford all of that stuff, you end up working more, transferring jobs, more money, seeking the dollars, more. And as a result of that, when you come home, there's less of you, and each other. And pretty soon, the relationship, because there is no room, the relationship begins to suffer. Because when you come together, you just feel so stressed out. You got nothing left in reserve. And it's just this vicious cycle. Now, what's interesting is that this is nothing new, is it? I mean, if we know that this is true, here's the question I have for you, is why do we do this to ourselves? Why aren't we making adjustments before it's too late? Why aren't we spending less money in order to duplicate more time? Why don't we learn to just say no to a few activities and just allow some room into our schedule to just relax a little bit and rest a little bit and have some fun and just play some games as a family? Why don't we find ways to be intentional about relaxation and find ways to recharge our emotional mindset and our health and our spiritual lives? Well, those are great questions, and there's probably, I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or any of that, but there's probably a lot of ways. But when I think of all of the reasons why we don't make correction and why we don't put more healthy boundaries into our lives is for me, it kind of comes down to one simple thing, okay? And I think the answer is this right here, is because we don't want to disappoint who? True? I mean, you don't want to disappoint your spouse, you don't want to disappoint your kids, you don't want to disappoint your best friends, you don't want to disappoint your neighbors, you don't want to disappoint your boss, you don't want to disappoint your family. And so we honestly begin to buy into the idea that if I say yes to everything, that it's going to help me find favor with everyone. So in an attempt to not disappoint anybody, we begin to move the boundary tighter and tighter and tighter and tighter to our absolute maximum limit. To which we might ask the question, well, Pastor Brian, how did I get here? How did I do that? How did I end up moving from there to some health to where I'm at now, where I feel completely stressed. How did I get here? And I think that this is probably one of the most common reasons right here, and so that's why I'm going to give it to you, okay, is it's this right here, is that you're watching and listening to everybody around you. I think that's the number one reason. And the reality of it is that we see our neighbors' kids, and they got all this stuff, they're involved in all these activities, and we hear our neighbor talking about how good Johnny did in his kung fu, and, you know, he took first place, and she did that, and man, she's going to make the Olympics, and she's only 4, but I mean, she's, and we're thinking to ourselves, well, man, they're such good parents. I want that for my kids, so I guess I better enroll my kids in that stuff too, and I guess I better buy that stuff for my kids too, and meanwhile, you got to pay for it, and you got to find time in your schedule to run your kids around to participate in it. And then, of course, you know, let's talk about the false financial standard that we buy into as Americans. Okay, we don't want anybody to think ill of us because the kind of car we drive, or the kind of house we live in, or the kind of yard we keep, or the kind of toys that we lack. Okay, so again, in an attempt to do more and to have more, we end up spending more, and we have way less time. And we tell ourselves, well, you know, I can afford just a small pay. I can increase the payment just a little bit. I got a raise. I got 50 cents an hour. Let's see here. That equates to like $40 a month. Man, let's go get a new car. I can improve that. And we just ride up to the limit, right up to the maximum. Okay, now listen. I, of all people, okay, I got no problem with toys, fun, vacation, any of that stuff. Just come to my house. You'll see it all. Okay? I love doing all that kind of stuff. In fact, I love it. You want to go have fun? You just let me know. We'll go have fun. In fact, my wife used to say, okay, now, I got in trouble once because somebody misheard this, okay? But my wife used to say that I'm the capital F in fun. Okay? And it's true. I am. I'm the F in fun. Okay? Careful, okay? Okay, listen. I love all that stuff. You want to have fun? I'm all in. You want to do the toy thing? I'm all in, okay? But listen to me. Not at the risk of maximizing my life to the absolute brink. I'm not going to do it. And the reason is because I used to be one of those guys. And I got myself into trouble. So here's the thing. Is that the good news is that when we look at Scripture, when we look at what God has to say about our lives, we quickly begin to recognize that God has actually put some healthy boundaries for us to establish in our own lives to keep us from falling into this trap. Okay? So, how many of you brought a Bible with you today? That's always a scary thing to ask, okay? Okay, some of you did. If you brought a Bible, I want you to turn to the book of Exodus, chapter 20. Exodus, we're going to go old school today. All right, Exodus is, chapter 20 is where you're going to find a common portion of Scripture that we probably all heard about. It's called the 10 Commandments, okay? 10 Commandments, okay? Now, I want to share with you a principle today that I have learned the hard way. Okay, is that right? To some extent, I'm still learning this principle, and I fail at it regularly, but I keep practicing. I keep trying. Because I was one of those guys who was watching and listening to everybody around me. I had my eyes set on the wrong things. I was one of those people that believed that if I just worked harder, if I just worked a little more, that all my problems would go away. I was one of those people that just believed if I could just spend a little more, if I just had a little more, that I would just be a little more happier, okay? And I just pushed, and I pushed, and I pushed, and I pushed, and I found myself that my current reality and my maximum limits, that space between there, the boundary just got smaller and smaller and smaller to the point that I had gone over the line, and I literally collapsed. I literally broke. I literally had all kinds of problems. And that's a story for another day. I'm happy to talk about it anytime. I'm very transparent and vulnerable about that, okay? But I found myself at the brink of disaster until I began to practice the principle that we're going to talk about today. And the principle that I want to share with you is this right here. It's the Sabbath principle. Would you just repeat this with me? The Sabbath principle. Come on, with enthusiasm and projection. Here we go. The Sabbath principle. Okay? Let me read to you how God describes the Sabbath principle, and then we're going to talk about how you can implement it. Okay, here's what God says. Now remember, God is giving a list of how many commandments? 10. Okay, this is number 4 on the list. Okay, so it is like in the top range. Okay, and here's what God says in Exodus chapter 20, verse 8. God is telling Moses, he's telling Moses to write this down because he wants all the children of Israel to apply this principle to their life. And he says, remember to observe the what? The Sabbath day by keeping it what? Holy. Okay, so now there's 2 words that we're going to focus on here for just a second. I want to talk to you about Sabbath, and I want to talk to you about holy. Okay, so when we talk about the Sabbath, typically what we think of is we immediately begin to think of a specific day. Right? Okay. So for most of you, you think that today, Sunday, is the Sabbath. And you've been kind of taught, or you were taught, or you learned that the Sabbath is Sunday. Okay, well actually, the Jews actually practiced the Sabbath on Saturday. Okay, in fact, the Seventh-day Adventists, they practice that on Saturday, okay? And so you can argue about all that stuff, but we're not going to argue all that today because when we study the true definition of this word Sabbath, what we learn is that Sabbath really means to cease or stop, to be absent, to come to rest. So God says, I want you to remember the what? The Sabbath. And one of the first commands that God implements as a boundary for his children and for his people was for you and I to observe one day a week in which we practice Sabbath, to cease, to stop working, to just get absent from the grind of life, to relax, to rest, to just breathe a little bit and just kind of shift our focus away from everyday common work. But also, God said that we were not just to practice the Sabbath, but we were also to keep it, what was the next word? Holy. Now let's just identify what this word means, okay? Because when you look at what God said in the original language, what that really means is that it's removed from the common, or it's set apart. Okay, so we're not just supposed to practice the Sabbath one day a week, but we're to recognize and begin to implement the idea or the mindset that on that Sabbath day in my life, whatever day of the week I choose to honor that I am going to just set that day apart from all of the other common days, and I'm going to treat it as a holy day. All right, you with me? So that is what God says about the Sabbath. Now let's go on here, okay, because God goes on to say, he says, listen, he says, you got 6 days each week for your what? Ordinary work. In other words, I want you to notice here that God, he says, you don't have a minimum of 6 days to do your ordinary work. You have how much? A maximum of 6 days to do your ordinary work. A max. A maximum. That's the limit. That's the absolute limit. Which means that if you want to have some more boundary, you got to what? Create some more space. God says the maximum is 6 days. That's your limit. You can't go past that. All right? So you can get all that done in 6 days, and if you can get it done in less than 6 days, God says that's great. Okay, so listen, God established a boundary, and one of the first boundaries that he established is that we work a maximum of 6 days a week to do our ordinary work. And then God goes on and he says this. He says, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest. How? Dedicated to the Lord your God. In other words, what God is saying is that the Sabbath day for you shouldn't just be viewed as your day off, but rather, God says that we're to dedicate our Sabbath to him, that I should view it as a sacred day, as a holy day, that day belongs to God. And so just in case you don't understand what God is saying, he gets really, really specific in verse 10, and here's what he says. He says, on that day, no one in your household may do any work. And then he gets really inclusive. He says this includes you, your sons and your daughters, your male and female servants, your what? Livestock. You can't put them to work. Okay? And any foreigners living among you. In other words, this boundary is so critical to our lives that God doesn't want you pawning off all your work duties on your pets, on your neighbors, on your livestock, on your kids. Okay? This is like a sacred day for God. God established a boundary in which you're to set aside at least one day for your entire household to rest, to unwind, to get absent, to just begin to relax and stop, to breathe, is the way we described it in another series, to just get away from your normal routine. And then God, he explains the reason why this is so important. Because in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and everything that is in them. But on the, what day? On the seventh day, he did what? He rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. In other words, what God is saying to Moses is, look, I'm not just telling you what to do. I'm practicing this. I'm demonstrating this for you. I worked 6 days. Now, by the way, Moses, I'm God. Okay? So, because I'm God, Moses, I worked a maximum of 6 days, and then I decided to take a break. Moses, you and the children of Israel, you're not me. You don't have the capacity I do. You don't have the wherewithal that I do. You don't have the threshold that I do. And so you are to follow, at a minimum, my example. You work 6 at a max. You take a holy day. You rest. And so what's interesting is that when we follow this example, that is, when we choose to cease, we choose to be absent from, to rest, to just kind of dedicate a day to the Lord, what happens is that God actually blesses our Sabbath as well. And somehow, don't ask me how it works, I just know that it does. Somehow God, he has the ability to redeem our time. He has the ability to redeem our energy. He has the ability to take the efforts that we used in 5 or 6 days and to multiply those. He has the ability that all that we deem important, to help that remain important in our life, that it doesn't fall off, because we have chosen to practice this Sabbath principle. Okay? Now, as we kind of start to wrap up this series, this lesson for the day, I just want to give you a little bit of a history lesson, okay? Because thousands and thousands of years ago, whenever God established the Jews as his chosen people, he mandated that they begin to live within some healthy boundaries. And so what God did is he gave them a list of these 10 commandments, and you can go back and read all those in Exodus chapter 20. It's amazing how simplified God makes it for you and I. Just do those 10 things. You'll do pretty good in life, okay? And so God said, you're going to have these 10 commandments. And at the top of that list was how much time we should spend working in our life. So, what God said was that at sundown on your last day of work, the minute that the sun sets, you're to stop working until the sunrise comes up after the Sabbath. Okay, so in reality, God actually dedicated like 5.5 days for them to create the Sabbath day, but who's counting? Okay, we're not going to get that picky because I know some of you are workaholics like I am, and you need that extra half a day for whatever reason. Okay, but you need that. So let's just go with 6, okay? To which we might ask God, well, God, man, 6 days, there's just so much that I have to get done. And God would say to you, go home. Rest. God, you don't understand. If I don't make more money, if I don't work this extra overtime shift, if I don't, God says, listen, go home. Rest. Go home and rest. Get that through your thick head. Go home and rest. For the next 24 to 36 hours, God wants you to rest, to just get away from it all. Okay, listen, in the children of Israel, the Jews, it was actually against the law to work during this time period. They couldn't sow, they couldn't reap, they couldn't harvest, they couldn't go and milk their cows, they couldn't ride their oxen, they couldn't pawn it off on their kids, they couldn't have their slaves or their servants work, they couldn't even let their employees work. Everything was supposed to come to an end, to cease to exist, to rest. All they could do during that time, check this out, was hang out with family, was to hang out with their friends, to unwind a little bit, to just get away from the grind of life. That's all they were permitted to do. Now, some of you are thinking, man, that actually sounds pretty good. To just have a full day to hang out with my family, to have a full day to hang out with my kids, to have a full day to hang out with my spouse or my friends, or let's do it all together, just to hang out and just unwind and relax. Listen, God made it a command that you do that. In fact, God went on to say, if you read the Old Testament law, that it wasn't just a day, the seventh day, but there was actually a 7th year that was involved in this process. And every 7 years, they were not allowed to plant crops for the entire year. Plus, they had to cancel all the debts of people that owed them money. They had to cancel that no matter how much money they owed. All gone. How'd you like to have that happen to you? Okay? To which we ask, man, how did they survive? I'll tell you. They trusted God. They trusted God. God said, don't do it. I'm going to obey. God even established some healthy financial boundaries for the Jews. Did you know that they were only allowed to live on a maximum of 80% of their income? Oh, yeah. Yeah. The first 10% was supposed to go to the church to help offset the expenses of the church, the synagogue. Okay. The other 10% was supposed to go to the poor. Okay, to help the poor. Just imagine if churches across America begin to do this in our own culture. All those people that drive you nuts, begging you for money on the side of the road. Okay, some of you get really critical of that. Okay, what would happen if you just decided, you know what, I'm going to follow God's law, and I'm just going to give 10% of my income to whoever needs it more than I do. Okay, that's how God said it. And if you were a Jew, by law, you were not allowed to live on 100% of your income. Why? Because it's not healthy to live there. It's just not healthy to do that. God wants us to understand that everything in our life needs a healthy boundary, whether it be our time, our morals, our employees, our land. We need a healthy boundary in our life to make things right with God. So, as you study the Old Testament law, what is so amazing to me, because some of it is like really kind of a snooze fest when you read through it, and it's not very inspiring. But when you read through it enough and you kind of begin to put a few collective things together, what we begin to observe is that God knows that we could live life to the max, but he doesn't want us to. Okay, so in other words, he knows that we could pack more into our schedule, but he invites us to step away from that kind of activity because he doesn't want us to live in chaos. God knows that we could spend all of our money on whatever we wanted to do, but he's inviting us to step back from that mentality to prevent us from going into disaster. Okay, so here's the deal, is that whenever the Israelites ignored these kind of boundaries, what we begin to see in the Old Testament particularly is God said, hey, no problem. You want to ignore that healthy boundary? Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to let that enemy over there that's pestering you come in and wipe you out. And then you'll just become slaves of them. And then you'll begin to figure out, as a slave in a foreign nation, how good my boundaries actually are. And that's exactly what God would do. Is he would allow the Philistines to come in, he'd allow the Babylonians to come in, he'd wipe them out, they'd haul them all off, and then it was years and years and years, and eventually they'd come around and say, oh God, we're so sorry. And God'd say, okay, here's your freedom, let's try this again. Okay? Because God views this as mandatory in our life. And all of this, what's interesting is, seems just so good to us. It just seems so obviously good. And yet, it's so difficult to live by. So listen, all of us, each of us, we can only be in one place at one time. That's a limitation, isn't it? That's a maximum for you. You can only be in one place at one time. We all have financial limits. Some have a little more financial limit than other people, but we all have limits. Now, if you're a man, you can only think and do one thing at a time. But if you're a woman, you can do and think tons of things at one time. We could have some fun with that, couldn't we, ladies? Okay. Listen, God created us to just have some limits. Created us to have some boundaries, which means that he also has a plan for our life to experience health, to experience joy, to experience peace. But it's not with the absence of healthy boundaries. So, what does all that mean for us today? Well, this week, I want you to write down this question that I'm going to throw up on the screen here for you in just a minute, okay? This week, I want you to write this question down, and I want you just to begin to think about this in every area of your life. And here's the question that I want you to wrestle with. It's this right here. How much space do I have between my current reality and my maximum limit? Just write that down, take a picture of that, okay? Get a tattoo of that, okay? Whatever your thing is, okay? How much space do I have between my current reality and my maximum limit? Now, let me help you, because what I think would be amazing is if you ask this question in every area of your life. As it relates to your money, as it relates to the relationships that you have with your kids, with your spouse, your work, as it relates to maybe how much time you're spending watching TV and stuff that isn't good for you. Okay? I know people say, well, Pastor Brian, I don't watch all the news and stuff. I just watch football. Oh, okay, because that's so much more healthy for you to just sit there all day watching football. Yeah, great. Okay. Listen, I want you to evaluate this question when it comes to your diet. I've been evaluating that question when it comes to that. Okay, I'm at my limit. I tell you right now, I'm at my maximum limit. Me and the doctor had a talk about that the other day, and she confirmed my ideas were true, okay? All right? I just want you to think about this stuff in every area of your life. Okay, what are you looking at? What are you spending time? What about your emotional health? Where are you at? How much space do you have in your emotional threshold right now? Because some of you, you're just so on edge and you're so delicate that one little thing comes along and, man, you're just in the toilet for a month. Okay, just evaluate it, okay? It would be cool if you could do that. Now, the question is that as we evaluate this question, what would that look like for you to just begin to move those boundaries backwards a little bit so that you could say no to some things, so that you could find some more room, so that you could have a little more space? What would it look like if you just begin to honor the Sabbath principle in your life? Just pick a day. It doesn't have to be Sunday. Maybe it is Sunday. Okay? For me, it's not Sunday. Okay, because I'm a pastor. I work on Sundays. So my Sabbath happens to be on Monday. Okay, and so today after lunch, we'll all go to lunch. We'll have a good time having lunch. I will go home, and my Sabbath will begin with a long nap. Every Sunday, I wake up, I veg out, I don't do nothing, hang out with some friends, and tomorrow it's me and Kimberly all day. All day. We don't have nothing on the calendar. We don't do nothing. We just veg. We hang out. Hey, you want to go to the snow? Let's go to the snow. Whatever we want to do, we just honor that day together and we guard it. So my Sabbath happens to be Monday. So whatever your Sabbath is, what would it look like in your life if you just begin to practice the Sabbath principle in your life, just to unplug, to disconnect, to rest, to have some room, to gain back some emotional stability? Listen, all of us we got limits. There's limits that we personally choose. There's limits that our society and our culture puts on us. Okay, but our limits. We have also a third option to follow the limits that our Heavenly Father has created for us. But the choice ultimately is ours. Okay, so here's the deal. If you want less stress, if you want more joy, if you want more happiness in your life, if you want just more space, I just encourage you to just evaluate this question. How much space do I have between my current reality and my maximum limit? And just begin to move the boundaries. Because the more space that you create, the healthier you will be. And quite frankly, that's one of the ways that we create healthy boundaries.